To put it into context, we'll discuss the history of Ukraine and Russia for the moment. Kiev was founded in 882, not 1882, 882. Very much different from the Russians. They do have a different alphabet. There's a letter in Ukrainian that's not present in Russian that looks like a H, and the Russians can't pronounce it properly. And that's how the Ukrainian intelligence can tell Russian infiltrators by asking them to speak a few words. Culturally and everything else, they are quite different nations. The Ukrainians think they're better, of course. Then on to Hitler's Casus Belli, which is this 5,000-word essay he wrote published in early 2021. And in hindsight, it was obvious that a war was coming once this had been published. Now, the early lessons were the Russians are vulnerable to deception, survivability depends upon dispersion. Russia's been described as an artillery army with some tanks, and that's what came to pass, that they had a 10-to-1 at its peak advantage in artillery over the Ukrainians, and they basically have blown through all the patronymy of all the artillery stocks they inherited from the Soviet Union. But now it's sort of more even, and the Russians are still outgunning the Ukrainians about 2-to-1, but the early days, it's much improved. Now, war on the ground has traditionally been an artillery affair for the last couple hundred years. And in North Korea, for instance, General Ridgway, commander of the US forces for a while, said that on average it took 3.2 tons of artillery for a single North Korean casualty. Now, if you say a 155mm round costs $1,000 for about 50 kilos, 55 kilos, you get 20 to the ton. That's 3.2 tons. It costs $60,000 in North Korea, using dollars of the current day, to cause a North Korean casualty. At its peak, by comparison, seemingly, that the Russians were spending $200,000 per Ukrainian casualty in mid-last year. And its cost effectiveness of delivering high explosive on the battlefield is a large determinant of the current warfare in the age of industrial warfare. Now, early on the Ukrainian side, Bayraktar drones were quite prominent, but then they became far too easy to shoot down, and we haven't heard about them anymore. But the Ukrainians are currently going through 10,000 drones a month. And on both sides, it's become a big drone warfare, supporting the artillery. But what it's proved is a war sorts things out that military manoeuvres can't figure out. So some Russian aircraft being shot down are found to have their sensors still covered with their protective plates. That has improved. Now, the Russians are very big on electronic warfare. Now, what you see there on the end of that wing of a Su-27 is a Kilbin EW pod, the electronic warfare pod. And there are similar systems in the West, the Spectre of the Rafale and the EPAWS system of the new F-15EX, and the Gripen E has got electronic warfare built into canoe fairings on the end of the wings. But the Russians have found that their system isn't all that good, and it causes fratricide amongst the units. Some early lessons: dispersion and survival. There is no sanctuary. The Russians were attacking 300 or 400 kilometres inland from day one of the operation. Air Force survival is very much dependent upon dispersion. The trouble for us, the lesson here for us, is the F-35 has to go home each night. Anyone fighting from Tyndall, which is our only base that can handle the F-35 in Northern Australia, it goes back to its air conditioning, and it goes back to its 600 DC power supply, without which you can't turn it on. And also, if it sits out there on the tarmac in summer, in our northern summer, it will soak up heat and you won't be able to restart it. So that's the lesson, big lesson from Ukraine for us, is the F-35 is quite unsuitable regarding any enemy that we have knows that Tyndall is the only base it can operate from. All you have to do is take out the runways and we're done. Now the photograph there is that the Ukrainians realised that they had to practice dispersal operations, so they practiced landing on highways, and that's a Su-27 that's almost sucked in a road sign. So the lesson there is take down the road signs before you try to land on the highway. And also another lesson is reduce your logistical tail if you can. Now the Ukrainians are very good on operational security for the moment, so it's almost impossible to find a photo of a Ukrainian fuel tanker on the net. So I had to substitute in a US Army one, that's 9,500 litre one. But it also means if you're consuming fuel unnecessarily, that means your logistic tail is a lot larger than it need be. And it has to go a lot further back from the front line to survive in the current environment of deep strike behind your front line. So the lesson for us there is the tank we're relying upon is the M1A Abrams, which has a gas turbine engine, weighs 70 tonnes. It has twice the fuel consumption of the Leopard 2, which has a diesel engine. Now, they compensate in range by having a fuel tank on the Abrams, which is about 1,000 litres. It's twice as large as the fuel tank on the Leopard, so they can go the same distance. But the Abrams requires twice as many fuel trucks, things of this size, to support it in the field. Now, early on, the Russian systems weren't operating all that well in terms of navigation and reliability. They've run out of stocks, and they've ended up using some missiles, anti-ship missiles, for attack land targets. These were things built in the 1980s. But for the most part, the Russian systems have been accurate. Now, they fired a lot of things. This is one of them, the Iskander. It had a good reputation, still has a good reputation, although you can shoot them down. But if you look at the numbers there, this is as at November last year. They'd fired 839 at Ukraine, with 119 left of their stocks, and they make them at 64 a year. So it's going to take them well over a decade, once the war's over, to rebuild the stocks back to pre-war levels when this war's over. And that's a penetration aid of an Iskander missile. It deploys 6 of them so that the target balloons out in radar return, and you don't know which one is the real missile and which one is a penetration aid. But in the last couple of weeks, there's been a couple of interesting developments. From the start, the Russians and the Ukrainians had the S-300. The Ukrainians are running out of S-300 missiles, and that was going to leave them largely defenceless, but the Yanks have supplied at least 2 Patriot batteries. And they had a couple of interesting results in the last 2 weeks. So, back on the 14th of May, the Russians decided to take out the Patriot battery that was defending Kiev, and they fired 18 missiles at it, all to arrive at the same time, including 6 Kinzels, which is an air-launched hypersonic missile from a MiG-31, 9 caliber missiles launched by Tu-95s flying over the Black Sea. They were coming from the south, the other things were coming from the north. 2 Iskanders, which you just saw a photograph, and 1 S-400. Now, the Russians are very practical people. If they make a ground-to-air missile, a SAM missile, they'll also make it so that the software can make it hit ground targets. So having a surfeit of S-300 and S-400 missiles, which these things fly 150 kilometres, they've used them in ground targets in Ukraine. But anyway, the Patriot battery shot down all 18 of these things in a 2-minute period. And that's all good, and the Russians sent 2 reconnaissance drones over Kiev to see what damage had been done. Those were shot down by Gepard, a German system, radar-controlled 25mm cannon. And part of one of these drones hit the part of the Patriot battery and caused some damage, and the Ukrainians fixed it up with duct tape. So this attack, quite an expensive attack, estimated it cost the Russians about $120 million to launch it. It resulted in no damage of the Patriot system. Then about a week after that, about a week ago now, there was a Patriot system in northeastern Ukraine that shot down in a similar sort of period, a couple of minutes, 4 aircraft, 2 Mi-8 helicopters, the electronic warfare variant, an Su-34 and an Su-35. Now, this was all a strike package, so that Su-34, which is a ground attack aircraft with two crew, would attack some target in northeastern Ukraine, and the helicopters were there to provide electronic warfare support against the Ukrainian systems, and the Su-35 was to provide top cover. The Patriot battery shot all down 4 of them. Now, this being the modern age, already we have photographs of most of the crew. Now, there's an error there. I found out today that there were 11 killed, not 9. Each of the Mi-8s would have had 4 crew, the 2 flying it and 2 operating the electronic warfare systems. The Su-34 has 2 crew, and the Su-35 has 1 crew. But anyway, the significant thing is that all the pilots and crew are very young. The average age of those people you see there is about 25, and they've stripped their training establishments and their academies to provide frontline staff. So it reminds me a bit of Argentina's attack on the Falklands in the early 80s. The Argentinian pilots were very brave, actually. A lot of them got shot down, and it took the Argentinians 10 years to train another set of fighter pilots for their front line aircraft. And the Russians are going through the same thing. They're actually just destroying their training establishments in order to get a short-term battlefield effect. Some of those blokes there still have their puppy fat by the look of them. Another penetration aid that has come in the last couple of weeks, actually, when the UK supplied Storm Shadow cruise missiles, which have a range of about 350 kilometres. One of the first things they attacked was a Russian base in Luhansk. And these are parts of a MALD, miniature air-launched decoy, that was shot down to provide cover for that Storm Shadow attack. Now, the MALDs were first introduced by the Americans in the 90s, and the first iteration had a unit cost of 30,000. This thing costs 322,000 US, almost up to the price of a cruise missile itself. Now the air war. The Ukrainians were technologically outclassed and outnumbered. What you see there is an Su-35, and the main missile that it fires is the R-77, and they can engage targets up to 110 kilometres away. But in the last 4 or 5 months, this has become the dominant aircraft on the battlefield. The MiG-31 first flew in 75, 519 built, and it's had a kill against the Ukrainian Air Force at 177 kilometres, which is basically from here to Bunbury, was able to track, lock on and shoot down a Ukrainian aircraft from 177 kilometres away, firing the missile at the bottom, the R-37, which is a range of 400 kilometres against a non-manoeuvring target, about 200 against a manoeuvring target. Enormous weight of 600 kilos, but bear in mind that most air-to-air missiles are around 150 to 200 kilo range. They've been firing up to 6 a day and being quite effective at pushing the Ukrainian Air Force away from the front line. Now this is a radar system that is quite effective. The Russians introduced it in 2018. It's a 48YA6 Podlet-K1 surveillance radar. And that's how it stands up on the right, and on the left is how the thing folds itself for transport, and can up and move in about 3 or 4 minutes, which is very important if you're a SAM system and want to avoid incoming missiles. You'll notice that on that truck, those radar faces have rotated through 90 degrees, so the thing can fold over the truck and be far better for transport. And this thing deserves a lot of respect because earlier in the war it shot down a was involved in the shoot-down of a Ukrainian Su-25 at over 150 kilometres away. This is a ground-launched missile from a S-400 Triumph system, which had lock-on after launch, had locked on after the apogee of the missile. And this is what the Ukrainians have, the S-300, but they also use this thing, SA-11, the Buk system. Now, as an aside, back in 2014, MH17 was shot down over Ukraine by one of these. But I blame Malaysian Airlines, which actually tried to save a couple of $100 worth of on fuel by flying over a war zone instead of treating the war zone with proper respect. Now, both sides, because it's too difficult and dangerous now to fly along the front line and bomb the opposition's army directly, they're now flying unguided, and they come up at very low altitude, just a few metres off the ground, arc up, and then shoot their unguided missiles. And it has some effect, but it's largely a waste of money. Better off to going with guided missiles from here, which haven't been developed yet, but never mind. And that was a spectacular shoot-down earlier in the war with a man-pad from just about where the explosion is, shot down the Russian helicopter coming this way, and took about 1 kilometre to crash, but it was quite a high-resolution video. Now, this is another fact that's pertinent to the war with China, if and when it comes, in that by the end of May, so only in 2 months of war, the Russians had fired over 2,000 cruise missiles and ballistic missiles and the like against Ukraine. They did have an effect on the power system at one stage, and places like Kiev and Lvov were having blackouts. But 2,000 missiles and life goes on in Ukraine. The bloke who runs the central bank of Ukraine was able to take delivery of a brand new roller just about a month ago. So that Russian attack hasn't badly affected. And the lesson from that is, even a few thousand Chinese missiles into Taiwan, unless they just concentrate on the power system or something like that, may not have a large military effect. And therefore, it is not necessary to be overly afraid of the initial Chinese strategic missile onslaught. Another thing that the Russians have done, they've run out of their own cruise missiles, so they've bought Iranian ones, and they traded some Su-35s for a number of these, Shahid 136, which has quite an interesting warhead. So what you see there is the warhead out of a Shahid shot down without exploding, and at the either end you'll see fragmentation, but in the middle, those big brown splotches are slugs of copper. So that when the thing explodes, the explosion front goes down, the warhead, those form into supersonic jets of copper, which then punch through some distance. The trouble with just pure high explosive, it dissipates with distance very rapidly. And bulk of the damage is done by anything in metal that you can accelerate to supersonic speed. And even better if it's a supersonic jet of molten copper. Oh, and another thing. Early on, when the Russians started firing these things, 2 Ukrainian Su-27s have been lost due to firing them down, shooting them down, and then ingesting debris into the engines. So this is my take on what the situation is in the air war along the front line. Both have got S-300, S-400 systems which stop ingress from the other party's aircraft. They're mad pads along the front line itself. Short-range engagement by SA-11s, the Buk system. But the Russians have got the upper hand by a combination of MiG-31s, AWAC aircraft, and the Su-35 firing and Su-27 firing the R-77. Also, it should be borne in mind that the Ukrainians have been trying to take out S-300 and S-400 systems using HARM missiles, homing anti-radiation missiles, fired from modified MiG-29s and Su-27s, but almost all of them get shot down by the Russians. And it's happened before. This is in Serbia, the war in 1999. The Serbians fired 815 SAMs against NATO aircraft, and they only downed a couple of them. It's a 0.36% success rate. And NATO fired 743 HARM missiles at Serbian SAM sites. They only destroyed a handful of them. So most missiles, over 99% of all missiles in both directions missed. It's something to bear in mind about the terrible cost of conducting warfare that a lot of missiles miss. And this is an interesting photograph. It's skill marks on an Ukrainian S-300 system. He shot down 22 cruise missiles, 9 helicopters, 1 Su-27, 6 Su-25, which is a ground attack aircraft. But they probably wasted those missiles on the remaining 3 types of UAVs, which should be left, cost effectively to radar-controlled 25mm cannon. Because otherwise you're expending a missile that weighs a couple of tons against something that weighs probably 100 kilos. Now the war's dragged on, a lot longer than most people expected, and Russian doctrine has changed in response to that. Now early on they had about 150 battalion tactical groups, which is basically a little combined arms unit, and they've given up on that, and they now have 4 types of infantry, which is disposable. That is the Wagner's convicts and new conscripts and all that sort of thing. Line, who basically sit in the trenches and defend against Ukrainian attacks. Assault, which go through their own front line after the weaknesses on the other side have been found by the disposable troops. And specialised. Now some of those specialised troops are quite good. The Russian engineering corps has been quite effective in building bridges, pontoon bridges. In fact, sometimes they'll blow up a pontoon bridge just to deny the Ukrainians access to it, even though they might need it themselves at some point, because it's so easy for them to do engineering work like building pontoon bridges. Now it's still an artillery war. Last year the Russians fired off about 12 million rounds. Currently their rate is down to about 7 million rounds a year. They produce 2.5 million rounds themselves, so they're still going through their stocks. Now, as at April this year, the US was producing 20,000 155mm rounds a month, up from 14,000 last year. As for ourselves, about a year ago, there was a 155mm facility built in Maryborough in Queensland. Rheinmetall and Neuer, an Australian company, run it. And that could produce 8,500 per month on a 3-shift basis. Now early on, the Russians, to save their own troops, you fire a hell of a lot of rounds off. And eventually a barrel wears out. And then one of the last round you fire through that barrel blows the barrel up. So this is a Russian self-propelled gun that has lost its barrel due to the round exploding in it. Also, it was noted about 3 months ago, the Russians started using tanks in indirect fire support, which would mean that their barrels wear out, which means you can't use it to fight the enemy's tanks because your then barrel won't be accurate anymore. But it's one of those short-term gain decisions which hobbles you in the longer term. Now, the Russians are constrained by their ability to make barrels, artillery barrels for tanks and for field guns. I don't know what their production rate is, but apparently it's probably about 1% of what their actual need is, because they were still relying upon what was left over from the Soviet Union. And we see a lot of videos, or at least I do, of Ukrainian drones attacking Russian positions, but this is what the Russians use in return. This is the Orlan drone on the left, and both photos have got pictures of a human for scale, and on right is the Lancet, and these have been taking out quite a few Ukrainian tanks and artillery pieces and the like. And more recently the Russians have started fitting thermal blanketing to their tanks in order to reduce the thermal signature. And operationally, they've decided to start using tanks at dusk and dawn and the changeover between day and night and reduce the contrast. Electronic warfare. The Russians for decades have had an emphasis on electronic warfare and it has worked for them. They are able to stop the GPS signal on the front line, which means that if you're using things like the GMRS, which is the HIMARS rocket, it will lose its GPS position and then go off. They are also able to decrypt Motorola handheld field radios in just about real time, even though these things are encrypted, and then warn their frontline units that artillery attack is coming, for instance. But also they've so saturated their front line with electronic warfare signals that the Russian artillery units are complaining that once they get a drone above 30 metres, it can go berserk and wander off or crash, and that's because they've absolutely saturated the front line with at that frequency. The Russians' artillery units themselves have to find a hole in their own electronic warfare shield to put their drones through to see where to correct for their artillery spotting. Now, interestingly, the war in Ukraine vindicated air power theory, which is the modern air power war will be over in 3 days. Both mobs will send their fighters against each other up, and the larger and better force will prevail in about 3 days flat. And that's what happened over Ukraine. The Ukrainians knew that an attack was coming. They were able to disperse a lot of their SAM systems and preserve those. It was basically the static systems that got taken out. But their air force basically was exhausted after 3 days. And luckily their SAM system stood up and wouldn't allow a Russian access after that. What you see at the bottom of that slide is a table of the main beyond visual range air-to-air missiles used by around the planet. You'll notice most of them weigh about 150, 190 kilos, with the exception of the R-37 of the Russians. But what's come along in the last few years is Meteor, which is a German missile, air-to-air missile. And the difference is that all the others are rocket propelled. This thing is a ramjet, using a solid fuel ramjet that is throttleable. How they achieve that, I don't know, but it's a major technological miracle. Now, bear in mind, in your rocket propellant, half to 70% of the weight of your propellant is oxidant. If you can get rid of that oxidant and have the same weight, you double your range. Now, the range of the Meteor is said to be minimum 200, maybe up to 300. No one knows. At least I don't know. But it outsticks most other things on the battlefield. But bear in mind it costs €2 million for your 190 kilos, which is $16.45 a gram. And I've got the price of silver in there at $1.13 a gram and gold at $87 a gram. So these modern weapons makers are like the medieval alchemists. They're turning base metals, aluminium and copper and plastic, into things at the price of precious metals. So there are a few solutions to SAM systems. If you wanted to end the stalemate and be able to bomb the other side's troops, you've got to take out their SAM systems. Back to the Yom Kippur War, where the Israelis were holed up on the eastern side of the Suez Canal, and their aircraft were being shot down by SAM systems on the western side. They crossed the canal and took them out with tanks on the ground so they could operate over the West Bank. That's good if you haven't got operational depth, but the Russians can simply pull their SAM systems back if they can move them in time. The other way, as we've seen, is using miniature air-launched decoys. Now, I should say that those things mimic the return of one of your aircraft, so you can make it look like it's an F-16 or an F-15 or whatever, and that's how they're able to convince the other side. But it has to therefore travel at those sort of speeds at 800 kilometres an hour. And the other way of taking out SAM systems will be either cruise missiles, something stealthy like the Storm Shadow, or by long-range artillery. Now, this is interesting in that, let's go back in time. When the COVID came along and there was interest in the Wuhan Institute of Virology, the US Defence Department, some part of it, released data on the mobile phone traffic around that institute. There was a peak of mobile phone traffic around the institute in Wuhan in October 2019. And then realised, well, the Yanks are tracking mobile phone traffic in real time. So if you see a concentration of mobile phone traffic somewhere, that means something. So a week later, Putin banned the use of mobile phones by his troops in the field. Of course, it was ignored. A couple of years passed, we started a war. They chewed through their frontline troops. The conscripts were sent to this town of Makiivka in Luhansk province, about 20 kilometres from the front line, and put up in a trade practicing building you see on the top left-hand corner there. Now, there's also a Slavic tradition that on New Year's Eve at midnight, you phone home and wish your family good luck and good fortune for the coming year. So, just after midnight, this place lit up with mobile phone traffic. The Yanks monitored, told the Ukrainians. Ukrainians had a HIMARS battery in range with unitary rounds, and probably ate a whole pod of 6, and it killed 500 Russians and injured another 100 who were pulled out of the rubble of that building. That's an average cost of killing a Russian of $1,200. It's very cost effective if you can pull it off. But there's a combination of technology and cultural effects that led to this particular situation. The response of the Russians, of course, is to pull everything back further from the front line. So everything's back 70 kilometres beyond the range of HIMARS. But Storm Shadow's got 350 kilometre range, but it also costs $500,000 or £1 million or something. The next question you ask yourself is what's best in artillery? Traditionally, we've been towed. What Australia has is M177 towed artillery, 155mm calibre. But then after that, you may remember the whole kerfuffle about Australian Army buying of self-propelled howitzers. We learnt apparently of the existence of self-propelled howitzers when the Germans used them in Afghanistan, and they were quite useful. So we had a competition here, and there was Koreans came down against the PHZ German system. The Koreans won, and then our army lost interest in self-propelled howitzers. Then eventually we bought 30 from them, and we were going to build some more in Ballarat, but that's been shut down by the most recent Defence Strategic Review. Well, that may be a good thing if you replace it with the thing we should get, which is wheeled howitzers. And while self-propelled howitzers are quite useful, and the reason why you call them self-propelled, so they can carry about a few millimetres of steel on the outside to protect the crew. What happens with artillery duels and counter-battery fire is unless you move within a couple of metres, with a couple of minutes of firing off your salvo, you'll get incoming rounds, and your 155-metre shell has a lethal radius of 50 metres. So even if your incoming enemy fire doesn't hit your towed artillery piece, you'll kill the crew. So the solution is to put armour around them, but the armour has to be on tracks, and it turns out the tracks are slow and also cause maintenance downtime. Now beyond that is wheeled artillery, and a few countries make them, the French, Swedes, Israelis at least, amongst Western powers, and they've been found to be far more useful. So you can, as you see, there's a Caesar down there, you can pull up, fire a few rounds in about 2 minutes flat, and immediately head off before the counter-battery fire arrives. Also, it's shown that drones to correct artillery fire have resulted in a much reduced consumption of artillery rounds. You're down to 10% if you can correct early using drones. The Russians are running out of some things, including tanks. And this is a photograph of T-55s that have been in storage in Siberia on their way to Ukraine, to the front. This thing was first produced in 1945. The bulk of the Russian production was in the 50s. But I think it's quite inspiring that things approaching 80 years old are still useful.
Thank you.
But it's also said that they aren't being used to lead assaults. They're being parked about 2 kilometres from the front line, just beyond anti-tank guided missile range, and being used for indirect fire. That's 105 millimetre calibre. Most Western tanks are 120 millimetres, and the modern tanks of the Russians, the 72 and 80 and the 90 T90s, are 125 millimetres. Russians haven't been good at logistics, and that's been proved by this war. Early on, when they started in winter, a lot of their trucks, the tyres burst within 100 kilometres into Ukraine, because if you buy cheap tyres, they have to be rotated a lot. Even good tyres have to be rotated so that you don't have a thing sitting on itself. And therefore they've run out a lot of army trucks, and they've had to impress civilian vehicles. And what you see here is a priest from the Trinity Cathedral in Kurgan, which is a city in Russia, blessing a logistics vehicle on its way to the front. As well as this war being on the ground and in the air and at sea, it's also in the heavens. So that's a photograph of a Ukrainian Orthodox priest blessing a HIMARS launcher in the field. Now, the Russian army lacks logistics. It's got a lot of free labour, which they use to transfer shells individually from trains onto trucks and so on. And that's captured in this photograph of a Russian truck towing an unmanned ground vehicle to the front on its little tracks, because they've got no way of lifting that thing into the back of a truck or lifting it out when it comes to the other end. So they have to wear it, poor little thing out, just dragging it to the front, because they've got nothing better to handle it with. Quick graph on Russian losses in Ukraine. From the start of the invasion on the 24th of February 2022, there were around about 200 a day until the Ukrainian counter-offensive started against Kharkov, and then Kherson was later in it, and then started rising as the Russians mobilised convicts and people who were poorly trained to the front line, and it's now up to between 500 and 1,000 a day. They've now run through about 215,000 casualties, with a killed to wounded ratio of about between 1 to 1.2 to 1 to 8, whereas the Ukrainians have concentrated from the beginning on providing far better in-field medical care, and thus they've got a killed to wounded ratio of 1 to 7.3. Now, this is another lesson for the war with China, in that the Russians' army is bashing itself to death in Ukraine. To save their current position or whatever reason, that means that there'll be no second front when China attacks. The significance of that is the US defence budget and the size of the US military was traditionally run on the basis they have to be able to run a two-front war. There will be no second front. Therefore, we can concentrate on China from the beginning. Now we're going to tell the story about HIMARS and the most cost-effective solution to killing enemy soldiers in the field, but it all goes back to 1973 and the Yom Kippur War. The war was a big surprise to the Israelis themselves, who dominated the battlefields of Middle East from 45, 46 up to 1967, and dominated the air on the ground. The Egyptians and the Syrians had a very good plan, and that worked until the Israelis eventually turned the tide. But by then, the Western defence establishment at least the Yanks had a good relationship with the Israelis. So the Western US staff, inspecting the battlefield after the war, impressed by a couple of things. One was the rate of consumption of artillery. Second was the rate of advance. And so there are three big developments of that, which are still affecting us today. The reason why we have the F-35, for instance, is because of the Yom Kippur War. And in particular, the fact that, particularly on the Golan Heights, against the Syrians, the Israeli ground troops would call in air support, which we promptly shot down. They'd call in another lot of air support, and most of those would get shot down. Eventually they lost heart and stopped calling in air support. Bear in mind that air support is a luxury that only got invented due to a surfeit of Allied aircraft on the Western Front in the second half of the Second World War, that with fighter pilots with nothing better to do would go and shoot up the German artillery and troops and so on. And then it became radio controlled in the Marines and the like, and it became an institution of itself. And thus, even though the Yanks defence establishment has figured out that the A-10 is not going to survive on the modern battlefield, Congress have kept those planes flying and expenditure on those planes at the expense of other systems, because ground attack by ground support aircraft has been institutionalised at great expense. The second development from that Yom Kippur War was the Yanks adopted assault breaker weapon, which they developed from missile. Now, the Russians have been big fans of using missiles as artillery from the Second World War onwards. The Grad systems are famous on the Eastern Front, and from that they became bigger and bigger, up to 300 millimetres in diameter. But they're unguided and they're inherently wasteful. The third development from the Yom Kippur War was the concept of air-land battle, how to fight the Soviets in Western Europe, which was basically a reflection of the Russian concept of deep battle, that you engage the enemy's support units as they come forward in order to make your task on the front line easier. This is the history of HIMARS and where it went wrong. So it started out in 1983 as the M270, 12 missiles in 2 pods of 6. It was tracked. We do have a photograph of that. That's the top left-hand corner. And eventually from that was developed HIMARS, which is a wheeled. It's basically a parallel with self-propelled howitzers versus wheeled howitzers. But what it fired was a missile with about 30-kilometre range. It would sit behind the artillery, and if your enemy broke through with tanks and infantry, this thing would fire over your own artillery and try and break that assault by having a cluster munition. So each missile had 644 of these things, the M77 submunition, which was a shaped charge. It was stabilised by a drag ribbon, so it fell vertically. And if it didn't hit anything armoured or a truck or something, it would fragment. The case was fragmented and it would be like a grenade. It had a lethal radius of about 4 metres, 644, covered an area 200 metres in diameter, and basically everything within that either got a hole punched in its armour, because that thing could put a hole through 100 millimetre plate, which is 4 inches, say, or it would kill the troops, and quite effective in the Iraq War in '91. But then come the 2000s, and useful battlefield weapons became unpopular. There was a campaign against landmines and a campaign against this thing, that some of them, by simple being of a simple mechanical device, failed, and you had a dud rate, which left cluster munitions on the battlefield, and theoretically civilians had picked them up and killed themselves. So politically, the left in the US made the US Army drop the cluster munition, and alternately they had a thing called alternate warhead, which was 160 or 180 tungsten pellets, weigh under a gram each. Now tungsten's got an SG of 19, the same as gold. Iron's got an SG of 7, so intrinsically 3 times the density, so therefore it didn't slow down as fast going through the atmosphere. You could put more energy into each pellet. But it's only got a lethal radius of 50 metres instead of a diameter of 200 metres, so it only affects personnel within a quarter of the area that was serviced by the previous type of missile, and it had no effect on armour. So they do have a unitary warhead, which is 91 kilos total, with about 27 kilos of explosive in that 91 kilos, which is what a good high quality artillery round will have. But then the Yanks, when GPS was developed, decided to make them guided, so each missile could be guided individually. Otherwise it was an area effect. You just fired off a whole pod as many as you could at once, and but that was against masses coming. But by Afghanistan, they were able to fire off individually. And the beautiful thing about it, by then the range was 70 kilometres, so we could service targets 70 kilometres in one direction and 70 kilometres in the other direction. Each one of these batteries, single HIMARS battery, could service 340 kilometres of front. Very useful for that type of war. But the demand for range continues, and the next iteration is to tie the small diameter bomb that was developed for the F-35B. Because the F-35B couldn't take off with full-size bombs of 2,000 pound each, or about 1,000 kilos, for the Marines they developed a small diameter bomb with 250 kilos, 500 pounds, and then you could put wings on it and then it could glide a long way. And what you see in that photograph there, from the HIMARS missiles that were being dismantled to get rid of the cluster munition warhead, they still have the rocket motors. So the idea was, combine the rocket motor from the original HIMARS and attach a small diameter bomb to it, and you get 150 kilometres of range out of it. The thing will fly up to its apogee, the wings will come out, and then it can go wherever it likes, including doubling back or going into the side of something. It's not a cheap alternative. That's about 350 grand for something you could probably make for a fifth of the price if you had just one body. And for an historical note, because we've got people from the WA Military History Society here, the Nazis thought of this first. So what you see in the bottom there is a graph of the ranges of the V2s in their various iterations. And the first one had a range of 400 kilometres, but then you put wings on it and go further. And by the end, the Nazis were going to bomb New York from Europe using one of these at the top left with a range of over 4,000 kilometres. The pilot would bail out near New York and be picked up by a German submarine, but the missile will continue. This is how you get a cheap delivery of high explosive in the battlefield, that you loft a missile up to its apogee, it deploys its wings, and then you can glide, probably 10 times. Normal rule of thumb is you get 10 times the height. So if you're up 3 kilometres, you can go 30 kilometres. They have made better cluster munitions these days, so the Israelis are making cluster munitions and so do the Turks, as well as some others. But this can be made with a near zero dud rate, so therefore there's no ideological reason why we shouldn't deploy it on the battlefield. And the Ukrainian military has been begging the Yanks for cluster munitions since the war started, but they've been denied. Whether the Yanks have, they don't want to have the battlefield, cluttered with duds after the war's over, or they just want to drag out the war because the Russians are bashing themselves to death in Ukraine. The other ways of delivering high explosive at range, Excalibur came in the early 2000s, but that's $70,000 for a 155mm shell, delivers a few kilos of high explosive, but those little wings come out and it's quite effective. It has a 1 to 3 metre circular area of probability. It has been quite effective if you don't have to fire off a dozen shells, even at shorter range, in order to make sure something hits something. You only need one of these. And then beyond that, because that's only got a range of 50 kilometres, General Atomics is building a 155 metre shell where its carbon fibre wings come out at apogee, and it can go 150 kilometres. So, the lessons from the Ukraine war, we'll read through these, it won't be too boring. Land warfare still is artillery, shells and missiles. Tanks are necessary, we're just getting rid of ours, and under Strategic Defence Review, Australia just completed, we were going to buy 389 odd infantry fighting vehicles. That order's been now cut to 129. We should have 10 times that number. Ukraine is still begging for infantry fighting vehicles and tanks. To try to advance over open ground without armour, you chew through 3 times the amount of infantry. And to get over the problem of ATGMs, you simply adopt something like the Israeli trophy system, which has little radars on the corners of your vehicle, and it fires off short-range missiles, have a range of about 5 metres, and intercept the incoming anti-tank guided missile just 5 to 10 metres away from your tank. And that's a cost of about $1 million US per vehicle, so increasing the whole cost of the thing by possibly 10 to 15%. But tanks aren't dead, and neither are infantry fighting vehicles. Bear in mind, back in the 1960s, Australia bought about 830 M113 armoured personnel carriers from the Yanks. We had a population of about 12 million then. We bought 800 infantry fighting vehicles. We've now got a population more than twice that, and we're buying a fraction of the infantry fighting vehicles we had 50 years ago. Dispersion's key to survival, even 200 or 300 kilometres from the front line. You hide things and just operate with the minimum size establishment you can. Decoys soak up enemy ordnance. The Russians are doing that quite well themselves. Russian frontline troops are told to dig in. Once they arrive somewhere, they dig in and they start building their trenches and everything, and they keep digging. And they also dig and deploy decoy positions to try and soak up the Ukrainian artillery. GPS is great, but the Russians are killing it on the front line, and it doesn't work over the front line, therefore we need inertial navigation system backup. That's a bit more expensive. Australia should be making its own GPS inertial navigation system ourselves. Precision means you reduce the size of the logistic tail and you run the whole war at a much lower cost, even though it costs more per round at the front. Wheel is better than tracked, which is better than towed. We've only got towed at the moment. We can skip tracked and go straight to wheeled. Plus of munitions should get over whatever ideological problem people have and deploy them, because it's going to be a lot cheaper and save a lot of lives of our own troops if we have cluster munitions. Early on, it's like the Israelis would use a Patriot missile to shoot down a Syrian drone and spend $2 million to shoot down something that costs 10 grand. You've got to adjust the size of your system against the size of what's being thrown at you. And it's said that the Ukrainians are waiting at the moment to build up their operational reserve. Now, the First World War was largely, almost purely, on the Western Front and so on, a war of attrition, which is very expensive. Then on the Eastern Front, if you've got a large enough long front line, and you've still got millions of troops, but nevertheless, the way to run a war cost effectively is to manoeuvre, break through the other side's front line and then do an encirclement. And that's how you pick up a lot of their troops that are sitting out in the open as opposed to being in trenches. That is said why the Ukrainians are waiting at this moment to build up that operational reserve and to be able to break through and capture tens of thousands of troops at a time rather than sit there day after day. Oh, another lesson, don't get rid of your old tanks. You'll end up using them. And helicopters and ground attack aircraft are just near useless. Rather cost effectively, they're not worth it. That's all that can fit in one page. I'm sure there are more, but we must go on. Whether or not you believe there's going to be a war with China, the Chinese have said there's going to be a war. But anyway, well, let's go through. They want to be seen as the number one country on the planet. To do that, they need to displace the US. Xi Jinping turned 70 in September. It's also said of the Second World War that Hitler attacked when he did because he was turning 50. And bear in mind that a lot of people died in the 50s, back in the 1940s. And if he left it too long, he might miss out on his war. China's said that they're going to attack Taiwan. But deception is a big part of Chinese strategy. And if you look at satellite imagery of the whole region, they haven't laid almost no contract for an attack on Taiwan. Not a helipad on an island offshore between them and Taiwan. There's not great big ports that have been built very close to Taiwan that they can use and man up. They have laid a lot of concrete for attacking Vietnam. Also, we hear about the Chinese bases in the South China Sea, but all the other countries around the region have bases in the South China Sea. Vietnam has 30 of them. And that's making a mockery of the Chinese claim to the South China Sea. And also, China's been attacking Vietnam for the last 2,100 years. The first attack was in 116 BC. The last attack was in 1979, It was the main part of it was over in a couple of weeks when the Chinese got up in hiding, but they kept shelling Vietnam up to 1991. And Deng Xiaoping, despite his reputation as being a reformer and all that sort of thing, deliberately kept the war going to give Chinese troops experience, and they'd be wheeled up to the front, fire shells at the Vietnamese, and then they'd be rotated out by another unit. They'll attack on the same axis they did in 1979. They were constrained by topography, whereas Ukraine-Russia border is largely open plain, and you can cross wherever you like, as we saw last week. You're in North Vietnam, you're down valleys, and ATGMs, modern ATGMs, which the North Vietnamese could deploy if they wished to, have a range of 4 kilometres. It's very hard to take them out if they hide them sufficiently. Now, China likes to project itself as being a big and powerful country, but it's got a whole lot of frailties. They've got at least 800 million people, too many. They've got 1,400 mil. If they had 600, 800 million people, they wouldn't need to divert so much energy to keeping all those people fed. We're actually going to be fighting the 300 million in 6 coastal provinces that trade with the world. And also, to get anywhere, the Chinese have put their troops into ships and aircraft, which these days are very easy to find, detect and destroy on the modern battlefield at ranges of thousands of kilometres. How can we be so sure that China's going to start a war? Well, this is a graph that's updated monthly by the Japanese Department of Foreign Affairs. It's of Chinese incursions into Japanese waters around the Senkakus. The red bars and the blue line mean different things, but nevertheless, you'll see at the start on the left-hand side in 2012 that it all started when Xi Jinping ascended to the throne in China and immediately started them on this militaristic, aggressive path towards their neighbouring countries. Until this graph goes to 0 and flatlines at 0, war is coming to Asia. In the last Party Congress, which is a few months ago, late 2022, I believe, November, it wasn't as bombastic it was in the previous one, the 19th Party Congress. But if you read that and interpret it, Xi Jinping wants to write a lot of history in other people's blood. And they've been at it for some time. This is a primary school textbook map of Greater China as perceived by the Chinese, and this is a nationalist textbook from 1938, that they thought that their empire extends down to Singapore and into Western Pakistan. And actually what's quite amusing is that Google is largely staffed by Mandarin-speaking Chinese engineers, even though they live in California and so on. The office runs on Mandarin, including Google Maps. And even though Pakistan is one of China's better allies, and they've only got 2, Pakistan and North Korea, if you look at Google Maps on the border between China and Pakistan, they have a yellow line for where the current border is, and they have their preferred red line where the Chinese-speaking engineers in Google Maps' office think the border should be. It's well into Pakistan. Normally, when you attack somebody, to succeed, you have to have an economy or a force that's 3 times larger. So this is a graph of the size of the economies in East Asia, with Russia on the right-hand side. Well, they're also in East Asia by comparison. Russia's economy is not much bigger than our economy, 140 million people. Basically, they're driven by their oil production of 10 million barrels a day and their natural gas sales, which is what the Russian economy runs on. Otherwise, it'd be half or third the size of what you see there. But Japan, ourselves, India, all the countries are going to be attacked by China. Economies almost equal that of China itself. The US is a bit further again. And bear in mind, 1/3 of Chinese GDP is building empty apartment blocks. Eventually, one day, that will stop. And there's another historic analogy which I should mention. Back in the 50s, 60s, 70s, Israel, with a population of about 3 million people, held off 300 million Arabs trying to kill them and destroy them and run them into the sea. And that was bear in mind, that's when main armament was AK-47s and tanks and so on. And there wasn't much differential in the quality of your frontline troops. These days there's an enormous differential that someone simply armed with an AK-47 is not going to last very long. The important thing is that if you have the right technology, you can hold off a much larger force. Now, another thing that should be borne in mind with China, it's 1,400 million people, produce about 600 million tonnes of grain. That would enable them to live on a purely vegetarian diet. They have become more wealthy in the last 20 years, but they've imported a hell of a lot of soybeans and corn in order to feed pigs and chickens so they can have meat in their diet. And only recently I read an account of a coal miner in northern China. He only ate meat twice a year. And that's what they would go back to if they weren't able to import soybeans and corn. Bear in mind, in the Second World War, Australians were used to eating meat 3 times a day. And it was a sacrifice was asked of Australians to give up meat for 1 meal per day in that period to help with the war effort. And structurally, they're a very poor country. There's 425 million agricultural workers in China. So on average, each agricultural worker only feeds 2 other Chinese plus himself. Bear in mind, in the Western countries, agricultural workers are about 2% of the population, so each agricultural worker feeds about 50 other people. And I've heard of a farm here in WA that puts up 120,000 tonnes a year of wheat. So that farm would feed about 400,000 people from how many staff they got on site, probably 3 or 4. But why they're structurally poor is if they didn't plant rice by hand, they wouldn't have a rice crop. A lot of those terraced fields and so on rely upon intensive manual labour to keep them maintained, the fields maintained and the dikes and everything, and also to plant and harvest the crops. If they didn't have that hand planting and harvesting of rice, their production of rice would fall 150 million tonnes, and then a good chunk of them would starve. And that's captured in this graphic. On the left, you've got total plant protein that's hundreds of millions of tonnes of rice, corn, soybeans, etc. by source. The domestic is below the dotted line, and above that's the imported stuff. But bear in mind, soybeans are 36% protein, whereas most grains are about 10%, rice is only 5%, 7% here protein. And on the graph on the right-hand side, the column on the right-hand side is the proportion of total plant protein into the Chinese food system. And 40% of it, 41% of it's imported. Now, when the war starts with China, all those ships heading from Brazil and out of the United States to China to feed them so they can have meat and chicken on the diet, they will stop. Unless they've got very large stocks, and they do have some large stocks, probably 300 or 400 million tonnes, they're going to run out of animal protein pretty well straight away. Now, the length of the war in Ukraine has surprised a lot of people, including the Chinese, it would seem, because more recently, and there's a couple of other signs that the war's coming, the Chinese government has said we're going to increase grain production by 50 million tonnes. And that may be a reaction to the fact that they're aware that they rely upon imported grain. They thought that when they attacked Taiwan, everybody else would give up and run away pretty well straight away and things would go back to normal. But Ukraine's shown them that the Europeans got a little bit more spine than most people expected, and therefore, to still have their war and still feed their people at the same time, they've decided, well, try to increase grain production by 50 million tonnes, which is very reminiscent of Mao's Great Leap Forward, where at a conference in 1958, Mao said to the assembled commies, take grain as the key link. So back then, they did a lot of things. They pulled out orchards, filled in creeks, everything to plant grain. The current Chinese government is doing the same thing. They've now employed 80,000 officials to go and inspect agricultural enterprises. And there's now online photos of heavy earth-moving equipment pulling out orchards, pulling out vegetable crops in order to increase their grain production and trying to build terrace fields on very steep. They're going to be clearing virgin forest in order to increase their grain production. Other signs that a war was coming. This is an army base about 10 kilometres north of the Vietnamese border. I tracked its construction by satellite image over the last 8 years. I think I first came across about 2016. But in the right-hand corner, in the southeast corner there, this facing north, there's the original army base, and you know it's an army base, it's got a running track. Most Chinese military bases have running tracks associated with them. And across the road, they started building these buildings, and it looks like a complex of warehouses to hide the tanks, artillery. You see the ones in the middle, the smaller ones are for personnel, and that'd be canteens and so on at the right-hand end. In the last year, they built these ones on the western end. And you notice that it's been there long enough, 6 years, but the original paintwork's faded. And you can tell the age of each particular building by how much the red roofs are faded. Bear in mind that this is an area, a region of China, where all the industrial buildings have blue roofs. So that tells me that there's a centralised decision. They said you'll buy this steel from wherever it comes from, somewhere in northern China perhaps, and build these roofs, and they're already losing their paint. But the Chinese have continually expand this thing so that they can run their armoured brigades up to the border, hide them, at night, hide them in those buildings without any electronic signature, and to try to be able to do a sneak attack. Another sign is they're building artillery pads right along the border. The yellow line is the Vietnamese-Chinese border. And you see these roads, they're paved roads, running right up to the border, on top of a ridgeline, with a pad, and there's no other buildings, no other possible use for these roads with their pads at the end, but to provide fire support. This is a SAM site being built 20 kilometres from the border, well within artillery range. Once again, you know it's a military establishment because in the top northeastern corner you'll see a running track under development. The SAM battery is on the bottom left with a raised ramp in the middle, so you have a wheeled radar that runs up, sits up on top of that and provides radar coverage. But one original HIMARS missile could take that whole thing out because it's got a diameter of 200 metres, which is the footprint of the original cluster munition of the HIMARS. That's how they attacked in 79, and my guess is they'll use the same routes to attack into Vietnam. The South China Sea. So these are the countries that have bases in the South China Sea. Most of them are the red flag with the big yellow star in the middle, that's Vietnamese bases. And the Chinese have built 7 so far, 3 of them which have got 10,000 foot runways. That's what some of the Vietnamese bases look like. And the Vietnamese are told you will die defending these things. Now let's go back to Ukraine. Why the Taiwanese will fight and should fight, if I was a Taiwanese, is because when the Russians overran parts of Ukraine, trying to get to Kiev and so on, they lost some vehicles. Ukrainian intelligence got the Russian documents, and it told how they were going to run Ukraine after the war was over. First of all, they were going to kill off all the elite, and then depending whether you're cooperative or not, you were shoved off to a camp in Russia or you were left in place to cooperate with the Russians, but they were going to expunge Ukrainian nationality and character. The Russians are actually quite barbaric and don't have any illusions about it. And the other thing that's happened in China under Xi Jinping is that members of the Communist Party, there are about 80 million of them, and all senior officers in the armed services are required to do half an hour a day of study of Xi Jinping thought. And you can't fake it. You do it on your mobile phone, and there's a question and answer at the end that you have to answer properly. So it's an eternal torture is coming for anybody who wants to live under Xi Jinping. Now the first thing we should do with the Chinese attack is sink all their ships. They've got thousands of 100-ton plus fishing vessels around the planet. Some are maybe just 100 kilometres off Perth. Right at the moment we've got no way of touching those if we wanted to. Well, we have to have a plan to sink them all and all their other vessels. Bearing in mind they should all put out a signal, with a tracking signal, if they're over 500 tonnes. When those go dark, we know the war's about to begin. There is a parallel with the Second World War with Australia, in that Japanese pearling vessels used to come down to the Kimberleys in the right season, before the monsoon. And then before Pearl Harbor, the Japanese a military vessel, naval vessel came down, collected all the pearling ships and told them to go back to Japan straight away. As they were passing through what's now Indonesia, they got attacked by the Dutch Air Force. But beware of those signs, they will come if you alert to them. Now, the second thing we should do is hold a conference, a peace conference, regarding China before the war even starts, to determine how the Chinese assets are going to be carved up. Now, ideally, they should leave Tibet and other things that they've seized since '49. But they have built these islands in the South China Sea, which will be quite useful to somebody, because they've got 10,000-foot runways and quite decent ports and harbours and the like. And I believe we should divide those 7 bases up amongst those 3 countries. And the South China Sea will be a big kill-box for Chinese forces. They're 1,000 kilometres from Hainan Island, and they've got to run 200 kilometres past Vietnam, which have installed decent radars now. And we could make life very difficult for them indeed, as we should, because whatever they're attacking at the time, whether it's Taiwan or Vietnam or India, they will divert enormous resources in a futile attempt to save those bases. That's an idea of the airfields that are currently in the South China Sea. We only hear about the Chinese ones, we don't hear about the other ones from the smaller countries around the periphery. There is a potential for a stab in the back from the Obama faction that continues to run the US government now. Back in 2013, China agitated the US to make the Japanese give back 300 kilos of weapons-grade plutonium. The Japanese have been lent in the 70s. Now, that's probably enough for about 50 nuclear weapons of about 40 kilotons yield, assuming tritium boosting. Bear in mind that Japanese continually ask the US whether the nuclear umbrella is still in place, but the signs aren't looking good. And in fact, last year, an unofficial Chinese video came out, and there's nothing that isn't official in China, which a Chinese lady was saying, if Japan aids Taiwan when China attacks, we will end up nuking Japan at 1 city a day. There will be no negotiations entered into. The Japanese have to surrender unconditionally, otherwise we'll just keep nuking them. And also bear in mind that China, for decades, had a nuclear stock of about 300 warheads, supposedly. And more recently, Xi Jinping has gone on a path of building new ICBM fields in Western China. And they're increasing their rate of warhead production to get up to about 3,000 warheads, which is not just a response to a first strike and have a second strike capacity. That's a nuclear warfighting capacity they're aiming for, to be the equal of the US and Russia. Australia's force structure in terms of the Navy. Now, it's very easy to sink ships on the open sea these days. You can protect them from thousands of kilometres away, you can detect them from satellites, you can hit them in port, as Ukrainians have did with the Russian ships at 200 kilometres distance, which is just twice the distance across the Taiwan Strait. And the best way to sink enemy's warships is with anti-ship cruise missiles. And if we can sink their ships, they can sink our ships. So admirals like to have a navy you can see, and that means things that float above the water as opposed to things below the water. When the Soviet Union fell apart, the Russians couldn't afford a floating navy thereafter, so they just kept their submarines in the part, and the rest of the navy was left to rot and rust. We don't have either. We have submarines that are now 30 years old and worn out, and we're spending an inordinate amount of money trying to keep them maintained. And we've got a few large ships, but nothing to really make a difference in the scheme of things. The alternative is to convert passenger aircraft, 737s or A320s or the like, into cruise missile carrying aircraft, which will be much cheaper, have much longer range than anything else we can buy. And the Navy's got the same sort of mental problem the rest of the Defence Forces have. So on the left there, you see our latest offshore patrol vessel. Now, bearing in mind that we used to have smaller patrol vessels, then when Labor was in power second last time, they were used to go and pick up migrants, or illegals, off the beach in Java, basically. They only had to get outside Indonesian waters, and an Australian patrol vessel would go and pick them up. The trouble is being sent to sea so often, they weren't built to cope with it. And an Australian admiral was getting on a patrol boat in Darwin, and he looked up and there was a crack running down the length of the ceiling. This thing had been hitting the waves so often that the boat had started to open. So the solution was to go larger. So what you see in here left is the latest class, Arafura class. They're being built over here a few kilometres away, 1,640 tonnes, 40 crew. Its main armament is a 25 millimetre gun, which has a range of about 2 kilometres. Of course, it's got a couple of 50 calibre machine guns, but nothing else. It's basically a pleasure vessel that we're paying for and manning and doing next to nothing, as opposed to the infantry fighting vehicle choice is now between the Rheinmetall Lynx and the Hanwha Redback, and that's a picture of the Redback. It weighs 42 tonnes, got 3 crew, and being a 30 millimetre, the size of the range is the weight of the round being fired is 60% larger than the vessel over on the left, which weighs 40 times as much. We can be fighting a maritime war without flying boats? No. Actually, there is an Australian company starting to build flying boats in Darwin. They've got the licence to produce the Grumman Albatross that first flew in 1945, just modernised it with new turboprops and so on. We need a lot of those, because otherwise our ships are going to be sunk and our planes are going to be shot down, and the F-35 pilots we probably pay $10 million to train. They'll be sitting in the open ocean for weeks, all dying of thirst and everything else. We've got no way of collecting them except if we send a boat out to them, which might take a 2 or 3 week trip all up. I think we've gone through aircraft before. We should also push the Jawn system. They're currently about 1,000 kilometres behind our coastline, so that their coverage actually starts about at our coastline because it bounces off the ionosphere. We should push that forward to our coastline, and that would take us almost up to the South China Sea. And thus we'll be able to pick up enemy aircraft and ships, 1,000 kilometres earlier. And what I mean, we take passenger aircraft and convert them. We can buy second-hand 737s for as little as 4 million Australian. Now bear in mind that thing, 33,350 landings. Landings is what wears out aircraft, but you don't have to fly it once or twice a year. The pilots fly around all the time in our domestic air fleet. And the concept has been proposed before. I'm not the first person to think of this. Back in the early 80s, Defence Forces were always running out of money, and the US Air Force at one stage was interested in being able to fire cruise missiles without spending a great deal of money. So that's a proposal to convert a 747 to have rotary racks to hold the cruise missiles, and they're fired out of a port on the starboard side of the aircraft. Of course, the Nazis were there first. The first cruise missile that actually sunk a ship at sea was in 1943. This thing was dropped from 18,000 feet. It's radio controlled, but it sunk a 45,000 tonne battleship. Submarines versus bombers. You go through the maths. Bombers are a far more efficient way of putting holes in ships. Now, a torpedo puts a hole in a ship below the waterline, and a cruise missile puts a hole in the ship above the waterline. But you can deliver a lot more cruise missiles more cheaply than trying to use submarines to carry the thing up a torpedo a couple of 1,000 kilometres into the South China Sea. 737s versus a B-21. The Americans developed a replacement for the B-2. It's called the B-21, slightly smaller, slightly different shape, as we'll see in a moment. But it's got a capital cost of $700 million US per copy, which we call that $1 billion Australian, to carry a few tonnes. Still only can fly at night because you can see it from a great distance. And it's a relic of the time when to take out an enemy position with nuclear weapons, you actually had to overfly it. You couldn't use a cruise missile. That's the B-21 on the left and the B-2 from 89 on the right. There are only 22 B-2s built because it became so expensive. That's possibly our Air Force, future Air Force in being. That's the parked up aircraft in storage at Alice Springs. And on the Army, tanks aren't dead, infantry fighting vehicles aren't dead. We're currently shrinking down to 1 combined arms brigade. We need at least 10 times that. because the size of the enemy force has to be about 3 times the size of our force. So to win against 10 combined arms brigades, the enemy has to land about 30 brigades. But in the size of the country of Australia, to have one armoured brigade, not even an armoured division, is just ridiculous. Now, the iteration beyond HIMARS and putting cluster munitions back into your artillery missiles, it dates from the shape of HIMARS, and more or less you have to point the truck at what you're firing at, and the missiles go off. They don't have much freedom of movement. You don't actually have to have them in a pod that goes up and down an arm. You can actually have vertical launch systems. Just as our naval vessels went from having a magazine that was below decks and the missile was carried up to a launcher on the deck and then fired, you can have them stuck into something like a 20-foot container, which means in turn that you can put it on the back of an ordinary semi-trailer and you can be 50 kilometres behind the front line and not subject to enemy artillery. And that's basically field artillery spotting system at the moment. You have to have some forward observer and he has to call it in. Now the US Marines got to the concept that eventually one sergeant or a corporal or something running a squad can call it in his own missile strike, whether any other humans involved in the loop. That's the last 4 books I've published, and thank you for your indulgence in attending this.